moderation of the parameters. It's just complicated enough to not be able to get right away, but not so complicated that you get lost. So I think that's why it's probably one of the most satisfying kinds of ways that something can be Zen harmonic. Um, it's also hard to notice intuitively, I think. I think it's probably easier to notice certain characteristics of the intervals that would associate it with a particular tuning. For example, oh, this fifth sounds slightly sharp, so it might be 22 tone equal temperament, using logic like that. But using that sort of hearing to see if a song has Zen harmonic structural drift or not, I think is harder because you have to be really keeping track of the chord progressions more. It's kind of like comma pumps in that way. And this theory and comma pumps, could completely merge. I just haven't bothered to see which commas were pumped by these particular things because it might be different based on each interpretation. The thing about diagnosing Zen harmonic structural drift is it also involves a fair bit of subjectivity. The whole process, I think, depends on how subjectively eager we are to explain things in terms of the standard tuning system. And you can kind of make certain assumptions that will cause it to be more pliable. Like, for example, in a certain progression, if you decided that minor seconds should be used instead of quarter tones or something, so that it would be less Zen harmonic, then you could do so over the inverse. It might be easy to expect sort of like if somebody uses a Zen harmonic scale that it would automatically cause Zen harmonic structural drift, but I don't think that's really what happens. And I talked about that a lot more in my 2021 presentation, so if you're curious as to what I mean by that, I would suggest looking that up. Chord progressions that sound like a parody of 12-tone equal tempered progressions, they need to have qualities, I think, that sound somewhat triadic, just because microtonal music tends to lean into this or eschew it. Eschewed progressions don't need as much structural drift for Zen. What I mean by that is, if your harmony or melody is based on, some sort of novel construct that you don't have in 12-tone equal temperament, such as a high part of the harmonic series, or intervals that add up in a strange way, or a chord that contains a lot of microtonal crunch in it, that thing will already be so Zen harmonic on its own that it doesn't exactly nullify the effect of Zen harmonic structural drift, but it means that the music is already different enough from the standard tuning 12-10 to really count already. That's another important part of the 2021 presentation. The Zen harmonic tuning system and the standard tuning system don't have to be any particular tunings, they just have to be different from each other in such a way that we can compare them. So we're just assuming generally that the standard tuning system is 12-tone equal temperament. There's lots of ways in which music can be Zen harmonic intervallically. Music can exhibit Zen harmonic interval structure over time. So that refers to structural drift going through and sort of deforming over time. Structural drift same tonic means that the progression, when it resets, it goes back to the same tonic, and so something adds up in a funny way in that unit of repetition, whatever it may be. And then structural drift different tonic would mean that the chords definitely still drift into areas that they don't normally drift into. They add up wrongly, intervallically, but they get to a different tonic. So this sort of thing is usually reserved for modulatory phrases. In fact, our first example is something that you could say might exhibit structural drift different tonic-wise, but not exactly. Then there's local, adjacent, or near adjacent. That just means that if you have a note and you hear how close it is to the standard tuning, that's the act that you're doing. So notes that are in slot within around a J and D might just be barely noticeable, or you might be guessing. In slot noticeably flat or sharp means that there's something that you really do notice about the note that draws you, but that it still sounds like it has the character of the note it's imitating. And then out of slot means that the note has officially become a different thing. It approaches a pitch class in 2 times the EDO. 24-tone equal temperament is highly Zen harmonic in the local sense because it's as out of slot as you can be, right? Half the equal temperament. but it's very, very un-Zenharmonic in a structural drift-based sense, because you can't cause the structure to drift from 12 in any real significant way other than just going in the crack. So that's what I mean by these two different things, because they're two different real phenomena that are competing in the space for Zenharmonic labels and Zenharmonic identity. Each of these categories is fluid and used for basic phenomena. So there might be situations where something that exhibits structural drift does so because of how things are in or out of slot with particular notes in a local way, or vice versa. And the ideas, of course, also work in combination with each other, something we'll explore later. In fact, in one of my analyses, I mistook one for the other. The second song that we'll look at, whether a particular progression counts as being from one of these categories depends on which intervals are salient to the listener and constitute melodic/harmonic constructs, and or the contextual functions of the music. Again, I'll mention that there's a fair amount of subjective bias that happens when one listens to a chord progression and tries to figure out what's Zenharmonic about it, because they're hearing certain intervals will jump out at them more than others, and they'll think about those intervals more. And that's a good thing, I think, because when you're playing chord progressions, that's kind of what you're doing to think of chords quickly. You don't actually think of all the relationships. I mean, you could know about all of them and you could have a deep knowledge of them, but you try and get the surface level thing to jump in, basically. So let's talk about tonic comparisons versus adjacent comparisons. So if we're comparing something, if we're using a tonic-based comparison, that means that when we are comparing Zenharmonic notes and relating them to a standard tuning, which will be 12-tet for us, we compare each successive note to a single tonic note. So I will use 5-tet as an example. It's a very good example. If you have a 5-tet circle of fifths, C, G, D, A, E, well, the fact that you have gone to E is an adjacent comparison, because you're comparing C, then to G, to D, to A, to E. You're comparing the notes that are all next to each other to get to E. So calling it E, that's an adjacent comparison. But by the time you get to that E, it's so sharp that it's become a perfect fourth comparatively. So if you were to call it F and compare it to that first note, C to F, that is a tonic comparison. So now you understand the difference between the two comparisons. Adjacent happens over time, and then tonic is right there. So Zenharmonic drift has happened when there is a contradiction between adjacent comparison and tonic comparison. So tonic comparisons reference the pitch center and always point back home. We compare each new pitch to the tonic in terms of the standard tuning. Secondary tonics are a good future idea, like little pockets of measures that sort of have a different tonic than what's been going on. And then adjacent comparisons reference the surrounding melody and are as you go. So pointing back to home and as you go. We compare each new pitch to the note before it in terms of the standard tuning. Ranked comparisons to notes based on how close they are to the current note is another good future idea. So since this is so non-rigorous and subjective, a more advanced comparison system would be able to get all the intervals of the piece together in some way and sort of figure out how to compare it in a way that's more intelligent than doing it note by note or just single tonic by single tonic. It would be able to examine degrees of that are in between that humans might not be aware of. Like I think a nuanced adjacent comparison wouldn't just compare notes that are next to each other, but would also compare like notes that are second most next to that note and give it like a slightly less degree of impact, and so on and so forth. But I wouldn't know what form exactly that should take. But it would be a crucial part of sort of figuring out which things are Zenharmonic if you're comparing two tuning systems that way. There's some ambiguity in decision making in 22-tone equal temperament. Some of the approximations are really close to 24-tet intervals, like the up fourth or the 11th harmonic. If encouraging multiple interpretations of Zenharmonic structural drift, one could flip the approximation to the next closest semitone. So what I mean by that is that You could say that a fourth and an up fourth, if you have both of those in 22 tone equal temperament and they're both close to the perfect fourth, you could count an up fourth as a tritone in a situation where you deliberately wanted it to pass as one, even though technically, approximation wise, an up fourth is still closer to a fourth, just like a fourth is. So 22 has lots of these intervals that double as various things, and I was finding that when I was analyzing the songs that we're going to get into and looking at their Zen harmonic drift, the fact that 22 tones intervals became so normalized was really a source of my disappointment in the fact that there wasn't more drifting. I would find that there would almost be a drift, and then there would be some 22-10 interval like an up fourth that would count as a fourth that would snap it back to being in its normal sequence. Deciding which chord counts as tonic is ambiguous in some cases, and this is true for both shorter and longer constructs. I think in my first song that I analyzed, a Brendan Burns song, that is going to be the most ambiguous. I simply use the first chord, but it's a highly modulatory passage, so it might be smarter to analyze that song in terms of structural drift different tonic than structural drift same tonic, but I'm using same tonic here anyway. Another interesting question is how we should just treat microtones in general. Now, in 22 tone equal temperament, the smallest degree is still slightly larger than a quarter tone, so we can count it as a semitone. But if something is smaller than a quarter tone in a given microtonal tuning system, well, the closest approximation to 12 tone equal temperament would just be 0 in that sense, or just, staying on the same pitch. So this would be another situation where you could change it slightly so that more microtonal voice leading happens depending on what you're willing to count a particular interval as in another system. Not a lot of the music I heard used drifting in a particular mode. It was kind of hard to find instances of Zen harmonic structural drift, so these are 4 songs that I believe have those sorts of things. The first one is Entrance by Brendan Burns. This is a song in 22 tone equal temperament that is the opener for his album Neutral Paradise. It's very modulatory and very colorful. It doesn't exhibit that much structural drift. I created a tonic interpretation in 12 tone equal temperament and an adjacent interpretation. So a tonic interpretation, it's all comparing things to the same note that counts as the tonic. Adjacent interpretation is as you go. But, you can approach that from different angles. So the 2 angles I've done here are, well, if you have a tonic interpretation in the melody, it means you compare each note to the melody back to a single tonic, and then write its 12 tone equivalent. And then the same can be true for chord roots. So like if you move, D, G, A up, A, in 12/10 that would be, if D is the tonic, D, G, B flat, A, just because A up is slightly closer to a minor 6th. So that's what I did, is I did it using the melody and using the chord roots, so there's sort of 4 different methods here. This progression doesn't exhibit Zen harmonic drift almost at all compared to the original chord. Both 22 tone equal temperament and 12/10 progressions end a diatonic semitone higher. So in 12 tone equal temperament, we start on a D chord, and then go through the progression, and we end on an E flat chord. In 22 tone equal temperament, we start on a D chord, we go through the progression, and we still end on an E flat chord. But of course, the D and the E flat chord that are signposts in this song also have the up 4th or 11th harmonic in them. So of course that is a Zen harmonic local element that is almost completely out of slot. There are some moments where the interpretations do disagree midway through the progression, even though it doesn't actually drift, sort of the closer we get to the end. You can also look at the microtonal voice leading in this song. There's lots of instances where we have like sliding degrees by 1 that are very exciting. I didn't really take a super long look at this just because it would introduce some additional complications. But in addition to giving tonic and adjacent interpretations using melody and chord roots, I also tried to create like a best fit progression in some of these instances where like I take the things that I've learned from both interpretations and try and combine it into the thing in 12-10 that I think sounds most like the Zen harmonic chord progression. And then sometimes I'll take another one and try and drift it as much as possible based on what is allowed in these interpretations. So first, let's take a listen to Entrance. There we go, so that's the original song, and here it is rendered in MIDI. The tempo is kind of rubato, so it might not match up exactly. Okay, so I transcribed that, and now here are the interpretations. The 12-10 equal temperament adjacent interpretation. That's how, here's how this one sounds like. So that one I think is a pretty decent fit. Might be one of the best fits that comes from those straight interpretations. By the way, for the tonic comparisons, I am comparing everything to the first D chord. So I'm sure I would have gotten more interesting results if I had treated some other chord as the tonic. Okay, let's take a look at the tonic chord interpretation. So each chord, instead of being compared to the previous chord, like in the adjacent interpretation, is now being compared to the tonic and then written in its 12-10 equivalent based on that. So let's hear what that sounds like if the chords are doing that. after a few changes, I needed to change the quality of the penultimate chord to be minor, so that when that melody note held over, the break in the chain there didn't sound like it was unintentional. You also will notice the farther out we get, the more the chords sort of stray from a flatty area. You can see at bar 10 there's a G with a B in the bass, and then a C minor 7, whereas before we had an A flat with a C in the bass and a D flat minor chord. We also have an F minor 7 chord at bar 6, which was an E minor 7 before in the adjacent interpretation. Basically, there's a compromise that has to be struck between an ascending tritone in the melody being a seventh to something, and voice leading moving from one note to the other in the bass. Okay, this is the adjacent melody interpretation. My recollection is that this adjacent melody interpretation may be the same as the adjacent chord roots interpretation, except that we still have F minor 7 in bar 6 instead of E minor 7. Okay, here is the tonic melody interpretation. You'll notice that there are further and further discrepancies in the tonic melody interpretation. You can see that towards the end, the melody becomes so mangled that we have to change the quality of the chord again. For example, in the E flat minor 6 chord at bar 9, that note now has to be a C instead of a D flat, because in 22 tone equal temperament, if we're comparing a D flat to a D, well, D flat and D have now become so far apart that it counts as equivalent to a 12th minor 7th, or at least that's the closest approximation. So that's why that note has to be lower. The same sort of thing is true for the note on beat 3 in bar 11, which is normally, I believe, a C flat up in a D flat minor chord, but now we have a B natural instead. So that means that we have to change that chord quality similarly to before in the other tonic interpretation. So now I see that something drifted down enough that we were able to get D in the last bar because of how we compared this. Because G flat down in an E flat chord is like a super major third in 22 tone equal temperament, and that's closest to the major third in 12th ten, meaning that it would be rendered as an F sharp if we're comparing it to D constantly, right? So I decided to combine both parts of these interpretations and break the chain in a strategic way so that I have made this progression drift down a semitone in 12th tone equal temperament compared to its 22 tone equal tempered version. Take a listen. The crucial points are sort of in between the F major 7 at 6 chords, E minor 7, A major 9 with an E in the bass, and then G sharp 7 with a D sharp in the bass, as well as the D minor 7. Those chords in 22 tone equal temperament continually slink down in the bass by 1 degree or 1/22 of an octave, but this can't be